everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Technicals Podcast. This is a show interviewing people in different technical programming roles. Today, I am pleased to be joined by Dave Wasmer. So to kind of start off a little bit, how about you tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. As you mentioned, my name's Dave, and I have been in the software industry for, 12 years now, maybe 13. I don't know. I'd have to do the math. Started out shortly after college, got into it in the startup world, and spent about 10 years hopping around a variety of early stage startups. And I was typically one of the first few employees, employee number 1 to 5 or CTO or something like that. And lately, for the past roughly 3 years, I've been at Coinbase, the cryptocurrency exchange, and started out as a front-end engineer there and then moved into a manager role. So that's what I've been doing for the last few years. So yeah, it's a bit about me.
Nice.
I live in Colorado as well, and have worked remotely for the past 9 years or so.
Dang, okay. Great. Well, we can just kind of get into it after that brief interaction then. Starting from the very beginning.
Sure.
How'd you get into the program? How did you get into programming?
So I had an interest in it from a pretty young age. I taught myself programming starting in, it was like, I started learning in like 4th or 5th grade when I was a kid. And like a lot of people, it was originally born out of an interest in making video games. As a kid, I loved video games and wanted to be able to make my own. And so I started learning a little bit at the time of Flash, which I'm guessing some people may not even know what that is anymore. But historically, if you wanted to play a game online anywhere, then you had to use Flash, and so that's what I wanted to learn. And from there, I sort of kept it up as a hobby and as an interest throughout school. And then, went to college. I studied economics in college, but again, sort of kept programming on the side as a hobby. My senior thesis was a sort of statistical analysis of a particular game theory idea from economics that I programmed and ran a simulation of, which was fun. And then after college, quickly realized that the job prospects in software engineering are much more exciting than those of academia and economics. And so shortly after that, landed in the startup world.
Awesome. So along the way, so you already kind of mentioned you went to school for economics and all of that. So it was just kind of more of a side thing. How did you learn and grow that then if you weren't like going to school for it and stuff?
Yeah, so I was always sort of building little projects that interested me, but I also had an interest in sort of the commercial opportunities around it, I guess you could say. So in high school, I did a little bit of like freelance web design that helps with just like some summer money type of stuff. And then in college, managed to land some more sort of freelance type of opportunities for some local businesses that, again, sort of just provided me some spending money to get through the year at school. And then, I continued to sort of explore that after. So, the first job I had after college was at Whirlpool, the appliance manufacturer, refrigerators and washing machines and all that stuff. I was in their IT department, and I joined. That was not a programming job by any stretch, right? It was a sort of a general IT office project management type of job. But I sort of brought some of that programming ability to that role. Wrote some scripts to automate things that people were doing manually that were taking an absurd amount of time. And so through a lot of that kind of just trying to find little opportunities and doors to bring some of that into work environments, as well as just kind of working on open source projects and keeping myself busy with hobby stuff. It's not like there was any kind of grand master plan behind it all to land a job as a software engineer. It was more of just, this is stuff that I love doing and wanted to keep doing it, and it sort of turned into a career almost by accident in some ways. But
Yeah, that's cool. It's kind of just that self-driven then motivation of just loving what you do
yeah,
and just doing it. So sweet. What kind of
exactly.
like projects did you do, and what were kind of your favorite stuff to work on in those things?
Yeah, a lot of it would be stuff that sort of would scratch my own itch or would somehow be sort of interesting to me. You know, ideas for little apps and things. None of them ever went anywhere major, but it was always, interesting and fun to work on. So, when I was younger, like I said, it was a lot of playing around with little games and stuff and things like that. And then in high school and in college, it was more working on small apps and things. Little opportunities I saw. So, as an example, I grew up in Connecticut. As a kid, I sailed competitively, and I thought, hey, it'd be kind of interesting if there was some kind of sailing competition management app type of thing, right? They have these regattas, and there's a lot of bookkeeping and logistics to them, and I thought that might be kind of interesting. And so I learned some Ruby on Rails, I think, to try to build some of that out. A lot of it was sort of exploring that. I actually at one point tried to build a podcasting software, much like what we're using right now,
Hmm.
to allow people to record podcasts and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of it was just sort of things that interested me at the time, as well as some open source projects. I tried to focus on things that sort of I wish existed or contributing to projects that I particularly liked, in whatever way I could. Um, and sometimes it was small things, right? But GitHub has this kind of silly, but it's fun little badge thing, right? Where you can get these badges for particular accomplishments, right? And I think I made one pull request to fix a typo on the Bootstrap documentation once, and so now I've got like a Mars rover badge on my GitHub profile because like some NASA team used Bootstrap on their website or whatever. But it's just finding those things that sort of interest you and keep you going. I've helped coach a few people to learn programming one on one over the years, and one of the things that I always try to advise, and this is just coming from my own personal experience, but everybody learns a little differently. But one of the things I try to advise is to say you should have a project that you're working towards, something that you want to see exist in the world for its
Mm.
own sake, right? Because there are a lot of moments learning programming where you're banging your head against a brick wall for hours,
Mm.
right? Why, can't figure out this particular bug, what's going on. And you need some motivation to get through those times, right? And in my own experience and the people I've talked to, very few people find the programming itself so intrinsically rewarding that you're willing to bang your head against the brick wall for 4 hours to get through it.
Mm.
More often than not, you need to have some motivation of a thing you want to see exist in the world, and that is what drives you through those rough patches. And so that's a lot of what I tried to work on is stuff that interested me that I wanted to see exist in the world.
Yeah, no, that's great advice of having that motivation because you're exactly right. Coding can be people think that it's whatever. They see all the movies where people are like typing away like crazy and making all of these things. It's not that. You write like a single line, hit run, and it crashes, and then you spend 3 hours trying to get it to work. But how
Yeah.
would you do you think that then because then you got that job and you didn't have any school experience with programming and you got a programming job, do you think that were those projects part of the reason of how you got that job?
I mean, for sure, yeah. So they're part of the reason in the sense that I was able to get through technical interviews
Hmm.
mostly unscathed, and the job I got at Whirlpool was not at all a technical job, like I said. But the first real programming job I got was for a startup called Convey out of Boston, and and so part of it was the ability to get through those technical interviews, right? I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't sort of cut my teeth on those types of projects. But there's sort of a prerequisite step there, which is even just sort of getting past that first kind of resume review, or that first, like, is this person worth even, interviewing? And I mean, that actually is an interesting story in and of itself with Convey. But in general, I say um, you want to be able to try to show some level of sophistication, I guess. That, not that you need to
Hmm.
be an expert programmer or anything, but you need to show that you have the basics down. Um, and then you need to show sort of that eagerness and that willingness to learn. Right. I was hired at Convey as a junior developer, and nobody expects somebody in that position to be an expert, right? But you need to be hungry and ready and excited and willing to learn. And I think that type of portfolio of side projects, open source work, that type of stuff, it helps show that drive, that initiative, um, that people are going to want to see out of somebody on the junior end of the spectrum. Because nobody really hires a junior developer to expect them to stay a junior developer forever, right?
Hmm.
You hire them so that they can grow and mature and become more senior and more experienced and more valuable. And so you want to show that you fit into that category of people that are able to mature in that way. So
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. That's great stuff. So, what was it like then? Did you have a lot of experience going into that job at Convey with specifically what they were doing, or was it very much so a like you were learning and you were not quite ready?
um, yeah, it was a little bit of both in a sense. So um, the the reason I actually got the sort of initial conversations and interviews at Convey, so it's actually a good story, but I was visiting some family for the holidays. I was living in Michigan at the time, and I went back to Connecticut to visit my family for Christmas. And I had some plans. I forget the specifics, but I had some plans. I think with my brother at the time, we were going to go do something, and he backed out at the last minute and just decided, he just wanted to hang out and stay at home. And so I was bored and had nothing to do, and decided to try writing a blog post, because I'd heard that was a thing that could help you, career wise, and I wanted to give it a try. I had written a little bit before, but figured I would take another stab at it. And I wrote a blog post that described an idea for a sort of business model and a startup in a space that's known as backend as a service. It's known as that now. It wasn't. It didn't exist at the time, really. And it was so. I published that to my website, and then posted the link to Hacker News. And for some strange reason, it shot to the top of Hacker News that day, and I remember sitting there like hitting refresh on my Google Analytics, watching thousands of people reading it. Um, and I was having a great time, but I noticed several people follow me on Twitter as a result of that blog post, and so I stalked all of them, as you can probably imagine. And one of them was the CEO of a company called Convey, which was based out of Boston, which was effectively building what my blog post described. They were building backend as a service, and he followed me on Twitter, and so I DM'd him on Twitter and said, hey, saw you followed me, probably as a result of the blog post, right? And I had no particular agenda. I just thought, hey, this is a cool opportunity. So I said, hey, can I buy you lunch or something like that, right? And just kind of have a conversation with you, and pick your brain a bit about startups and that kind of stuff, because I wanted to get into startups, and this seemed like an interesting opportunity. And and so he said, yeah, sure, no problem. Let's meet for breakfast tomorrow. And I kind of like left out the fact that I was in Connecticut and he was in Boston, Massachusetts. um, So the next day, I didn't even like have a car with me or anything. I had to have my mom drive me up to Boston to meet this guy for breakfast. And yeah, we talked about sort of the idea of backend as a service, the startup world, that kind of thing. And then we like walked back to his office and met the rest of his team. And it was sort of clear to both of us that there might be an opportunity here. And so, I ended up flying back home to Michigan, but I had some calls with them later and then some interviews, and that's kind of how I landed in that role. But I think what that showed was, number one, there was certainly some serendipity and luck there, right? Like I can't claim credit for that particular timing. But I do think that there's an interesting idea I've heard. I forget who exactly said it originally, but um, an idea I heard a while ago about luck surface area, and it's this idea that like people, a lot of people, you'll hear stories like this where it's like, oh, you got super lucky, right? Like your blog post went to the top of Hacker News, and the guy happened to follow you and happened to say yes to breakfast. Uh, but the flip side is that that happens to people that have enough surface area out there for luck to hit something. And so, I think that's a really powerful concept that like, yes, a lot of these things aren't guaranteed. I can't promise that if somebody writes a blog post tomorrow that they'll have the same story I do. But I can promise that if you don't, you're definitely not going to. And so a lot of it is this sort of getting yourself out there, getting enough surface area for something to happen, and then when it does, making sure that you capitalize on it as best you can, right? And so making sure that you take those opportunities, and I think that was an example of I did not even that I knew it at the time, but in retrospect, an example of showing that kind of drive and initiative, right? That somebody like this CEO saw. And I think from his perspective, I look back on it now and I think about what he was thinking in that moment. And I think he probably saw this is honestly not a super risky bet for him in some ways, right? Like this guy, shows a lot of initiative. He's passed our interviews. We know he can code on some level, right? I was clear with him when I joined. I said, I've never had a programming job before. I don't know what it's like to do this 9 to 5. So, there's a small chance that I'm going to find out I hate doing this professionally. um, but from his perspective, he saw it as, look, he's a junior engineer, so he's cheap compared to other engineers, and he shows a lot of initiative, and there's a chance he'll grow into something really meaningful for the company and the business. And there's not a lot of downside risk otherwise, right? And so that's kind of the sweet spot I often try to advise other people that want to follow a similar path to look for, is like, how can you present yourself as a large upside, small downside bet for a company? Because ultimately that's the calculus that they need to be doing.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really really great point and stuff. And this brings something to my mind that I'd love to kind of pick your brain about. Is I think that a lot of programmers and just people in general, they kind of recognize that if I put a foot forward and I'm constantly putting myself in that spot, then opportunities can come and I need to take them. But I think that a reason why a lot of people don't do that is because we have instilled into us such a fear of rejection a lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
of going for something and then being shot down. And so they'd rather just kind of cruise on the coastline and just chill at doing what they can, and avoid that. What do you think about kind of that fear of rejection and its place in this whole discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very natural and sort of human response, and I think it's very understandable. I think about it in a couple different ways. One is, you know, if I think back to my own story and the story I just shared around joining this startup, there at no point was there really sort of a fear of rejection in my mind, except for maybe like right at the end of the interviewing process, right, where I was,
Mm.
specifically waiting on whether I would get an offer. But publishing that blog post, worst case scenario was like nobody's going to read it, right? But that's not, it doesn't sting in quite the same way that outright rejection does.
Mm.
And when I went to have a meal with the CEO, I had no specific agenda. Obviously I had hopes, but no specific goal of like, oh, if I don't walk out of here with a job offer, I'm going to be disappointed, because I didn't expect anything like that. It was more of a, hey, this is just a great opportunity to get some exposure, to get some advice and learn from somebody who is in the thick of it. So in some ways, I think that first early stage of that like luck surface area process is can be kind of low emotional stakes in that you're
Mm.
not necessarily putting yourself out there with any particular specific expectations that can be, missed. That being said, um, that's not to say that it stays that way forever, right? Like,
Mm.
and if you want to be ambitious, if you want to grow, then you're going to have to learn to live with some amount of rejection. And it's easy to say. It's something that I struggle with still too, right? There have been times professionally where things didn't work out, where a project didn't go well, where a career move didn't work the way I wanted it to, and it's disappointing for sure. Um, it sort of reminds me a bit of the Teddy Roosevelt, "Man in the arena" type of quote, right? Like it's kind of part and parcel of success in some degree is failure, and so if you want just the success with no failure at all, then like sorry, that's not how the world works. It's a fallen world, but if you want to have if you're willing to sort of work through that rejection, then that's what's necessary. And I think a lot of it is also just sort of being aware of your own emotional state and acknowledging that, like, yeah, it's going to sting at times, and it's okay that it does, right? Like, it's not like you need to ignore that, or you're failing because you do feel that rejection. It's more of accepting that it's going to suck, taking a breath, and then getting back up and getting ready for the next step back.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's great stuff. So, kind of getting back a little bit after that, a little bit of a rabbit trail. Great rabbit trail, but it's still. What was it? So you have the job. What was it kind of like at that startup and working, especially now that you're in a programming role rather than IT?
Yeah, it's it's super interesting thinking back on it because it was, I had the job at Whirlpool for about 8 months. So I don't even include that on my resume anymore because it's a blip.
Hmm.
Um, but I think about that. That job at Convey was really like my first real professional job in my chosen career path.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because at the time I had nothing to compare it to, so it's really hard to talk about, like, how's the job going? It's like, I don't know. It's going. I don't know if it's going well or
Hmm.
not because it's hard to know. Um, and again, it's easy. Some I've listened to podcast episodes like this one of other people's stories. And it's easy, I think, at times to hear people talk about their stories and hear some kind of orchestrated, thought through plan that was perfectly executed over decades or whatever. Um, that there's none of that here, right? Like this is me applying a narrative in retrospect, but the narrative wasn't obvious to me at the time. But I would say career wise, one of the biggest sort of hacks, I guess you could say, that I unwittingly took advantage of was the fact that joining a startup like that has this sort of cheat code built in, which is that as the company grows and hopefully is successful, and thankfully Convey was moderately successful. It exited after I left. It never like crashed and burned. It didn't turn into a unicorn, billion-dollar company or whatever. But it grew and it was moderately successful. But as the company grew, I grew with it professionally. And the way that works is, if you imagine that you're a founder or a manager of some kind at a startup, and you're growing, you raise another round of funding, or revenue is increasing, or whatever, a team is growing in size, and I joined Convey in this case as employee number 4, um, and if you think 6 months, a year down the road from when I joined, let's say the team has doubled, and okay, now we're maybe going to like start to split into separate pods, right? We're going to have like this engineering pod over here, and this group of people working on this sort of other work stream. And maybe we don't even have dedicated managers yet, but we need at least some kind of lead, somebody to kind of orchestrate the group of 4 engineers over here, right? And as a founder, you've got a couple options there. You could go out and hire somebody a senior developer who's done this a lot before, right? And who is, from a sort of salary perspective, going to be more expensive. Or, you've got Dave here. And Dave hasn't really ever been a lead on a team previously, but he's been here since almost day one. And so he's got all the tribal knowledge built in his head. He knows all this. He knows the historical context for all of the decisions we made, why we built things this way, why we didn't build them this other way, all this stuff. And so, he might not work out. He might be bad at being a lead or something like that. But he's relatively junior still, so he's not as expensive as hiring a new senior developer. And he has all these advantages going for him of experience with the company and knowledge. So, like, let's give him a try. Worst case scenario, if the company keeps growing, then we'll have room to bring in another senior dev above him, and that person will be the lead and take over for him when things aren't going well. But what happens is basically, because you have all this historical context and because startups like this tend to grow relatively quickly compared to traditional companies, there tends to be this vacuum that sort of regularly appears, this void that needs to be filled constantly. Almost reminds me of like zooming in on a fractal image, right? Where it's just sort of more space appears, more complexity appears as the company grows. And what this means is there are all these little pockets of opportunity that start popping up everywhere, and they occur regularly and frequently. And each of those represent an opportunity for you to jump in and say, "Hey, I'm ready to sort of move up a level, take another level of responsibility and ownership." And that's ultimately what happened with me at Convey. I came on board as a junior developer, and I left as the leader, the manager of the front end teams, which I was managing, I think, 6 employees at the time, and that took 4 years. And
Dang.
I compare that actually to a place like Whirlpool. I joined Whirlpool in this they had this like sort of, they called it like a fast track to a manager type of role. And so I joined straight out of college, and their fast track was that you might be a manager in 6 years if you were speedy, right? And I did that, in less than 4 years at Convey. And part of that was just, again, that growth opportunity, right? Like, you're not going to see that kind of fractal growth at a company like Whirlpool. Whereas at a startup, you're going to see those opportunities all the time. So career-wise, I think that was one of the biggest things. And again, I stumbled into that. I didn't plan for that ahead of time, but it worked out. But when I first joined Convey, like I said, I was a junior developer, first programming job, and I really enjoyed it. I still do enjoy coding, and so I was routinely in the office until the last subway train would run at 1 a.m. And I'd have to leave the office and go home. But it was not because it's not because I was pressured to by the team or the company. It was because I sort of looked at it as like, look, I really enjoy learning all this stuff. I'm having a blast. And yeah, maybe I could go out and hang out at a bar with some friends or something. But like, why would I want to do that when I can be growing and learning and tackling all these interesting problems? And so, I was very sort of driven and focused in that way. And I think that sort of that definitely helped me level up my engineering craft very quickly by having that level of focus. And then I think, again, it sort of showed that pattern to the rest of the folks at the company that, I was the kind of person that was hungry for more opportunities. So when those opportunities appeared, I was sort of a clear choice for them.
Yeah, that's awesome. You basically just, startups are a great way for new people to kind of grow, and it seems like that's your experience, and it's awesome how like fast it can go and everything like that. Would you say that that's a thing that a new programmer who, let's say, they've never had a programming job, should it be a priority of theirs to look for small startups, or should they just take any job that they can get?
That's really hard to give advice on a general level like that. It depends a lot on your circumstances. If you've got, if you're worried about how you're going to make next month's rent, then like I'd say take whatever job you can get, right? Like there is some degree of being in a good enough position to be able to take advantage of some of these opportunities. That being said, I think there is something to be acknowledged here around like when I left Whirlpool, I had this moment that sort of stuck with me all these years later, where uh, I had only been there for 8 months, but they were a lovely group of people that I worked with, and I had a great time working with them individually. Right, I didn't much enjoy the work itself, but the people I worked with were great people, and uh, I was I was part of a cohort that was hired straight out of college, but the average age of the group there was significantly older of the people that I worked with. And as I left Whirlpool, there was sort of a get together on my last day, and we went out to a bar and kind of said farewells. And I was moving for the job at Convey. I was moving from Michigan to Boston, um, and so I was saying goodbye to these people, not just professionally, but I also was leaving town and probably not going to see them again.
Hmm.
And I had several conversations with some of the older folks there. I'm guessing maybe in their mid 40s, and they were telling me that oh man, this is the time to take risks in your life. I was single at the time, and I wasn't married, didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage. Right, I had no sort of obligations outside of myself. And they were looking at me and saying, "This is the time to take risks. This is a good move for you." Right, and there's some truth to that. Right, like that is a good time in your life to take risks. Um, but I thought about it at the time, and I look back on it, and I think it still holds true that in some ways that move was the least risky move I could have made.
Hmm.
um, because I saw people that sort of stuck with a Fortune 500 company job, and Whirlpool's headquarters, where I was working out of, are in St. Joseph, Michigan. Um, the nearest place that could have employed somebody with an IT role like that is probably 100 miles away. Like they're the only employer in that entire area that could
Hmm.
possibly employ people in the IT field like that.
Hmm.
And I looked at that and I realized if this startup Convey that I'm joining, if they go under tomorrow, there's 50 other startups in Boston that are hiring software engineers,
Hmm.
right? And so it's not that difficult to find another software engineering job, especially if you have sort of broken into the field. You have that on your resume that you did this professionally, right? Um, but if I spent another 10 years at Whirlpool, and then Whirlpool decided to have layoffs, and now
Hmm.
I'm stuck in St. Joe, Michigan, with a mortgage and a lot of responsibilities and not an easy ability to move around, and nobody can employ me. That's a really scary position to be in. And so, in some ways, yes, it was short term risky in the sense of the job at Convey was much less stable than the job at Whirlpool. But long term, I think it was actually the least risky option I had in front of me because it sort of diversified my options longer term. Um,
Hmm.
so, yeah, I think it is in general a good path. I'll say that, um, again, I was lucky in a lot of this. I know people personally who have gone to work at startups that um, the startup they worked at was, I'll say, mismanaged.
Hmm.
The Convey was great. The founder was fantastic. The team was great. Like I had a great experience there, and so I was lucky in that sense that it was a well run startup that was well executed, and I learned a ton. You can find bad apples in the bunch where you're gonna suffer as a result, but again, the nice part about that approach is that it's sort of a low cost, a low downside decision in the sense of if a startup goes under, there's a lot more out there, and especially if you're in a startup hub of some kind, right, where there's a lot more options. Or today, remote working is a lot more prevalent than it was back then, as well. So yeah, I think in general it's a good strategy, but you just be prepared for it takes a certain kind of personality. I have always been someone who thrives on sort of being given a very vague problem and just being told to solve it and
Hmm.
not really given a lot of direction. If you're the type of person that expects, when I start a new job, there's going to be a training program and there's going to be an onboarding buddy and there's going to be a lot of structure and guidance and a lot of help to get me started, this is not the path. Because when you're
Hmm.
employee number 4, the other 3 employees are all doing everything else at the company. They don't have time to help you. They don't have time to guide you and coach you. You know, they're friendly and you're in the trenches together, so they'll help where they can. But there's not going to be some kind of very structured and thought through program to get you up to speed. It's going to be thrown in the deep end without the floaties. If that excites you, then yeah, for sure, this is a great path. If that terrifies you, then like yeah, you probably want to go someplace more established that can help you cut your teeth a bit more first.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I haven't really thought about or heard that kind of perspective on startups. It's always just like startups are great, just go for it, you know. But I think that makes a ton of sense for having that kind of awareness of different personalities and stuff like that. So, kind of moving from there. So, of course, you mentioned at the beginning you worked in the startup years for the startup world for about 10 years. Where did you kind of go from Convey? How long were you there, and what was the next opportunity?
Yeah, so after Convey, I worked for a company called ClickFunnels, which is still around, I think, and that was about a year that I worked there. ClickFunnels is a sort of marketing landing page builder type of tool, but they've got a specific focus on these kind of funnel experiences that oftentimes are used by sort of e-commerce and they were really popular with like drop shippers and that type of stuff.
Hmm.
And so I worked there for about a year. It was an interesting company. It was bootstrapped product built by the two co-founders, um, and very very strong sort of product execution and marketing execution focus there, and they were very good at the marketing side of things.
Hmm.
Um, Ultimately, I left there just because it didn't really feel like it was the best sort of fit for what I was interested in working on.
Hmm.
There were a lot of really great success stories of customers that used ClickFunnels, and then there are a lot of stories of people that probably shouldn't have bought the software.
Hmm.
uh, and so it was one of those things where ClickFunnels wasn't doing anything wrong, but it was just I wanted to be working on a place that had a bit more of a sort of a net positive impact, I think.
Hmm.
And I think also there wasn't a great fit long term for what they were looking for. I was looking for moving into more of a senior ownership lead type of role, and I think that they were looking for somebody that was more sort of just execution focused on what the
Hmm.
founders' vision were, which is totally fair. If you bootstrap the company, right, like it's your company to do with as you please. But I was looking for a role where someone was going to be looking at me as more of the owner of a product experience rather than just sort of executing on what was being handed to me. So after ClickFunnels, I went to an agency actually. So a software agency called EchoBind. And I did that mostly because the people there I loved working with. It was a great
Hmm.
team, and I wanted to get experience and see if an agency setting would work. I had done a bit of freelancing in college, like I'd mentioned. I'd never worked for an agency before, and for those who maybe are sort of new to the industry, there is this kind of pretty big distinction between working for a product company or an agency, right? And a product company is where you're building your own thing, the company's own thing, their own product that you're selling. And then an agency is you're a hired gun, or you're out on contracts for various clients working on different projects at different times, and it's a very different experience. You're programming in both, but in a product company, you tend to be focused on one domain, one problem domain, for a long period of time. You can spend years building a single product and making it better and improving it. In an agency setting, you tend to work on much shorter cycles, right? So you're going to be working for a month or a few months at a time with a particular client, and then that contract will end, and you'll move on to the next client. It's a totally new problem domain, and there's aspects of that that are appealing, and I personally wanted to see if I liked it. It's nice to be able to kind of get the novelty factor of like exploring. I worked with Fortune 500 industrial manufacturers as well as a husband and wife team whose day job was at SpaceX, who wanted to build a mobile game for iOS. So it's the whole spectrum, right? And so it was certainly cool to see sort of the novelty factor there. But the part that ultimately I think had me leave was the idea that in an agency setting, how do I put this? There's very little reward in an agency setting for outsized impact. So if you push really hard, it almost doesn't matter because you bill by the hour. And so, yes, you'll get a better outcome with your clients, and they'll be happier, and you'll be more likely to get another contract and all that kind of stuff. So it's not that there's no reward, but it's all very linear. It's just it's time for money, 100%. And the best you can possibly hope to do is another contract. Whereas at a product company, it's possible for you to have this kind of leveraged impact where if you push really hard, you can have a huge effect on a small startup's product, right? And so ultimately, I think that's kind of what led me away from EchoBind. And then my last job prior to Coinbase was at a startup called Crash, where I joined as the CTO. And that's where I met Chuck, who introduced us. And that was a venture-backed startup that we basically took from nothing to launch. And yeah, that was I think I spent about 2.5 years there. Oh shoot, I'm forgetting the times now. But yeah, spent a while there. Sort of grew a small team and built out a product there, which was a lot of fun. But ultimately, we just didn't quite have the success on the product side, and so then moved on to Coinbase.
Nice, nice. So I always love because now you're actually because I also had Ilya Radchenko on as well. So I kind of got
Oh,
like
nice.
all of you Crash guys on. But and so I
The whole gang.
always, yep, no, literally. Was that all of? Was it just the three of you guys working programming wise, or?
Mainly, yeah. We had some other folks. We had a guy in marketing who did a little bit of programming and stuff in there, but it was primarily myself and Ilya, and there's one other guy at one point. But yeah,
Okay, cool. But so I always love getting the perspective because, of course, that startup you guys kind of saw the birth and like the start, the rise and the fall of it all.
yeah.
So what was it? What was it like working at a startup that didn't end up working out? How did you kind of process through
Mm.
that?
Yeah. Um, it was interesting because when I first started at Crash, I talked to Isaac, the CEO and the founder, and he had this vision that was very ambitious, and it was a classic sort of startup in the sense that it was one of these things that like either it's going to be wildly successful or it's going to go nowhere. But there's very few sort of middle outcomes for a startup like Crash. So just for context, the idea was um, long term, ultimately sort of building a better signal marketplace for talent, and built on this premise that sort of resumes and credentialism was not the most efficient way to search for high talent individuals. And what's better is being able to sort of show real work, show and show sort of through different mechanisms. And so, our focus was to initially focus on sort of the early stage job market where, if you imagine a very senior individual who's got 10, 20 years of experience on the job, their resume is actually a really good signal. Because that really matters as to what they've done, what they've gone through, what teams they've been a part of. But if you imagine somebody who's brand new to the job market, a resume that says I graduated with a business degree from a mid-tier college says almost nothing about you. It's a very low signal tool to be able to communicate your value as a potential employee. And so we started there with the idea that, maybe we can build alternative ways of helping people in this job segment, or in this market segment, find and land jobs. And so we built this sort of video pitching tool where you could record videos of yourself pitching yourself as a candidate, as well as sort of a resume alternative, a website, right? And you could kind of tailor pitches to specific companies. And it's the kind of thing where, like, again, there's very little, at least in my own imagination, there's very little room for that to have sort of a middle success outcome where it's like, hey, it works, but it's not blowing up. Either it's the kind of thing that's going to transform the way young people find jobs, or it's going to flop. And I talked about this with Isaac when I first joined, and he had basically the same read on the situation, and that didn't discourage him at all. And it was an interesting perspective, right? A lot of people would try to sort of hedge their bets. A lot of people would try to, especially in a founder role where you're trying to get people to join the team, you're trying to start something. A lot of people would kind of come in with kind of oh yeah, but there's a way that we could maybe make this work, even if it's not like a huge success, right? There's a lot of different opportunities. But he was kind of unapologetic about aiming big. And so on some level, I kind of knew the whole time that, like, this is a high risk, high reward proposition in the company's perspective. And it was freeing in a way to be able to look at it and say, yeah, let's aim for the moonshot, because anything short of that is going to, crash and burn. So, like, might as well aim big. But it was interesting over time, seeing sort of the different pivots that we went through, the different iterations of the product, right? Searching for some kind of traction here or there. The interesting part to me was that on some level there's only so much that you could do from an engineering perspective. At an early stage company that is ambitious like that, the core question is not an engineering question for 99.9% of startups. If you're OpenAI, then, like, yeah, the question is, can you build a large language model that's good enough? If you're not doing something wholly novel and unique from a technical perspective, then the engineering problem is actually not the hard problem to solve. And so in some ways, the real challenge for an engineer in that role is, how do we prioritize what the business needs? And sometimes that's going to mean doing the making sort of the boring or the not as sexy choices on the engineering side. Not using the latest and greatest technology, not using the not going for the flashiest experience, right? It's more about, like, can we just get something that people will open up their wallets for, right? Ultimately, the answer to that with Crash largely turned out to be no, but we tried a bunch of things on the way.
Yeah, well, awesome, man. That's really, really great stuff. So, kind of now from there, I think this lands us here at the present. Then, at working at what is it? Did you say, is it Coinbase?
Coinbase, yeah.
Okay, sweet. So, what's it kind of like? What kind of work are you up to now?
Uh, Coinbase is interesting. It is a much larger company than I've ever worked at previously by multiple orders of magnitude. Um, I think I don't know, I think we're something like 2,000 people roughly in that ballpark. The largest company I worked for prior to this was, so it's certainly very interesting. But I think the upside of Coinbase is that, the way I describe it is that I think it's in a little bit of a sweet spot where, if you're at a small startup, if you're one of 5 people, if you push 5% harder on your job, if you put in a little bit more effort, you can see an absurdly outsized impact on the company. Right. So, I remember times at Convey where, I would decide, hey, I'm going to stay late for a few nights this week and I'm going to, refactor this piece of code. And it would just, like, dramatically improve the experience of everybody else at the company, because everybody else at the company was 4 other people. Or it would dramatically improve our user experience, right? Because there's so little sort of impediment to just delivering value right away. The flip side of that, though, is that, like, at a small startup, you can have a huge impact on the company, but the company almost certainly has virtually no impact on the world.
Hmm.
Again, unless you're the rare lottery ticket, if you're Facebook or OpenAI or whoever, right? But if you're a team of 5 or 10 or 20 people, your impact on the world is tiny. Um,
Hmm.
and at the other end of the spectrum, you can find software engineering jobs at places like Facebook or Google that employ hundreds of thousands of software engineers. And these are world shaping companies, right? Like it's hard to think of companies that have greater impact on the world in some form or another than these large tech companies. But when you are one of 100,000 engineers, your ability to influence the company is almost nothing, right? Like you can
Hmm.
push as hard as you want. You're not going to change the direction of Google. Um, Coinbase feels like a sweet spot where the company is large enough and significant enough in the world dealing with sort of cryptocurrency and being basically the most trusted exchange for cryptocurrency and sort of a leader in the space that the company has real world changing impact. But
Hmm.
it's also small enough that if you push hard enough, you can actually meaningfully nudge Coinbase as a company. And I think there's a sweet spot that exists there that Coinbase lives in that probably other companies of the same size and position live in. And that's been rewarding in that sense, where my 10 years in early stage startups showed me that I'm not good at picking winners.
Hmm.
None of them were unicorns. None of them were wildly successful. And so this is sort of a good way of hedging that bet and saying I can still have some influence and outcome and legacy in the world, as well as enjoying my job.
Hmm. Nice. Well, thanks so much for being on. I think that wraps everything up. So, great meeting you. Great
Cool.
talking with you. Really, really great stuff.
Likewise, appreciate it.
All right, sweet. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and this is the end of the show.